Welcome. My name is Mark Raymond. I'm the director of the Cyber Governance and Policy Center at the University of Oklahoma. We are here today with Professor Ron Deibert from the University of Toronto. Ron is the director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs. He's here today to talk to us about his work with the Citizen Lab, and so I thought we might start simply by asking you, Ron, to tell our audience about the Citizen Lab.
So the Citizen Lab is a very unusual place for a university. Very exciting place. There's never a dull day. It's a research lab that I direct, about 15 full-time staff. We've been around for about 15 years, grown over time. We look at digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So cybersecurity is a big area, a lot going on. We don't cover the entire territory. Instead, we focus on issues like internet censorship, surveillance, targeted espionage against civil society. The signature of the Citizen Lab is our mixture of methods. We're truly an interdisciplinary laboratory. So I'm a political scientist, but a lot of the people that work for me are not. They come from computer science, engineering science, law, area studies, and other areas.
The Citizen Lab has done a tremendous range of really valuable work. One of your early reports was GhostNet, which focused, of course, on Chinese firewall and censorship techniques online. But your work has continued and has really grown, I think, with state conduct in this area as states have become more involved in doing this kind of very problematic conduct. And so I want to sort of ask you to share with our audience some of the more troubling behavior that you've seen more recently.
Well, actually, GhostNet was about cyber espionage, and we've done separate work on internet censorship in China. I think the cyber espionage is what's actually gotten really more troubling. And of course, it's in the news with Russian interference in the election and the hack of the DNC and John Podesta's emails. What we have tracked over the last decade is that many more governments are getting into the business of cyber espionage. The techniques that they're using aren't always very sophisticated, but there is a very growing market for commercial spyware, for surveillance, that's being marketed to governments, to security and intelligence agencies as part of the war on terror, as part of cybersecurity. Unfortunately, because many governments are authoritarian governments, a lot of that technology ends up being focused on civil society networks, on journalists, human rights activists, rights defenders, generally speaking. And that's the most troubling thing for me is that, you look back 20 years ago, most of us assumed the internet and digital technologies would empower social movements, would empower democratization. What we're seeing now is in fact the opposite. And that's, I think, a cause for everyone's concern.
One recent story along those lines was a story about the Chinese government using online messaging platforms to basically demand personal information, including scans of passports and personal contact information, names and addresses of relatives from members of the Uyghur minority in France.
Yeah.
So this is definitely a sort of continuing topic, but one I think, as you pointed out, that isn't only being engaged in by authoritarian governments. Democracies, our own governments do a great deal of this kind of thing as well. So I wanted to sort of ask you to sort of wrap up for us today by talking about practical steps for citizens and for members of civil society groups to do as well as they can at protecting themselves and to sort of protect as many of these freedoms as we possibly can.
Yeah, so at Citizen Lab, we do a lot of research on high-risk groups. So people who are really under the radar of some pretty nasty regimes, and maybe they're doing things like investigative journalism. They have very special risks. At the same time, though, because our work is in the media a lot, friends, family members, others always ask, should I be using this application or that? And over time, this became a great concern for us because as researchers, we saw there's so much low-hanging fruit. There are little things that could be done that people weren't doing to protect themselves greatly. So we created a resource called Security Planner. People who are watching can go to securityplanner.org and get customized digital security advice. Very basic things like using two-factor authentication, which could eliminate a lot of the phishing attacks that are going on. If John Podesta, the chairman of the DNC, had two-factor authentication on his email, we would have never heard about all of the exposure of all his emails and on WikiLeaks. I think companies can do a lot more too. The private sector needs to step up. So even though two-factor authentication is an option, something like less than 5% of people actually use it. If the companies made it mandatory or default on, I think it could raise the bar, kind of like a seatbelt for the internet. And I think we need to encourage the private sector to do more.
I would agree, and I think schools will have an increasing role here too, making sure that people at a young age are exposed to good practices for digital security and understand the sort of stakes involved for all of us in sort of our personal information, which is everywhere online. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
not possible to opt out.
As I say often, we're turning our digital lives inside out. So we're leaving this trail wherever we go, and we need to think about a new type of personal data stewardship over all of that information that's shared with, the devices that we have in our pockets, the camera that's filming us right now, the Wi-Fi network at this university, and the internet service provider in the city of Norton.
Yes, absolutely right, and local government as well plays a role.
As well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Ron. It was a real pleasure to share our work with your audience, your work with our audience. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks.
And hope you enjoy your visit.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.